hands around the world, I'm gonna let it shine. Holding hands around the world, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Shut down that old war machine.
I'm really excited about our first keynote speaker. I was so anxious to hear her that I put her on first. But I actually had a devious reason because I want to make sure you all got here on time. So I think it worked. And I'm honored to be able to stand beside Ann. We've done actions here and there. The last one was in Creech, I believe, 4 years ago, and where we protested the drone training. And but Ann, she gets everywhere. And one of her last actions was in Washington, D.C. over July 4th. She was instrumental in getting the Trump balloon floating above the mall. That was hilarious. Go to Ann's Facebook page, you can catch that. So, did Trump actually see it, do you think? Oh, okay. Because it was right out in front of the White House, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Ann Wright, she served 13 years in the U.S. Army and 16 years in the Army Reserve, and retired as a colonel. And in 1987, Ann joined the U.S. Foreign Service and served the U.S. diplomatic as the U.S. Deputy Ambassador in Sierra Leone, Micronesia, Afghanistan, and Mongolia. She was the first State Department team to go to Afghanistan to reopen the embassy in December of 2001. Her other overseas assignments include Somalia, Kyrgyzstan, Grenada, Micronesia, and Nicaragua. On March 19, 2003, on the eve of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Ann cabled a letter to resign as Secretary to the sent a letter of resignation to the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, one of the only 3 persons who resigned from the U.S. government in the opposition to the Iraq War. Since 2003, she has worked with Veterans for Peace and Code Pink, Women for Peace, to stop the U.S. assassin drones and to end the illegal Israeli blockade of Gaza through her participation in the Gaza Freedom Flotillas. She traveled to North Korea with Women Crossed the Dmz for Peace and on the Korean Peninsula. She has traveled to Jeju Island, South Korea, and Okinawa to challenge U.S. military bases and has been on peace delegations to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Iran, Gaza, and Cuba. So, please give a rousing welcome to Ann Wright.
All of your compatriots that have put together this wonderful thing called Peacestock. You were kind enough to invite me years ago, and something happened and I was by phone with you, and I've talked to most of the people that you have up there on these wonderful flyers. That is really, these things are the history of Peacestock. And when you look at all the people that have spoken here, I thank you very much for the kind honor to be here. And thank you for all the work that it takes to put together something like this. And we've got a full house, so good for you all. Yay! Well, Vets for Peace is one of the organizations that I work most with as a veteran myself, and I really do admire all of the chapters that we have all over the country. I think Vets for Peace has one of the widest scopes through its chapters of any organization that we have in the United States. And it really means a lot when we have veterans that are standing out on a corner saying, "No more war." And that really does, that hits people's hearts when we have veterans that are out there saying, "No, we've seen what war can do, and we don't want any more of it, and you shouldn't have your kids going into this sort of stuff because we know, we've seen the costs of war. We are the costs of war." And when you really look at all of the things that people have gone through, no matter which war it was in, or wars that it was in, the cost to the individual, much less the country, much less the victims of the U.S. wars. And the victims are a lot now. So for the last, 18 years, since October of 2001, when first it was the CIA paramilitary that went into Afghanistan, followed a month and a half later really by the U.S. military. The military didn't seem to have enough planes to get their troops in, so the CIA beat them to it. But since 2001, we've been at war. We've been at war 17, 18 years now. And when we look at all of the young men and women and older men and women who have gone to Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, where else? Well, and you look at the bases that we have all over the world, the 800 military bases. You could say, well, at least we don't have the old 1,200 we used to have, with many of them in Germany and Italy. Many of those have closed, but we still got over 800 military bases around the world. So the reach of the U.S. is far. And as the topic of today, the theme that you have for this conference is military service, homeland security, or empire building. And that's really a good way to look at it. Is it really what we are doing outside the United States? Is that really something that's protecting us, our homeland? Although I don't like that word. I don't like the word homeland. But is that really protecting us, or is it a part of what we call the empire building? And I would say that my vote goes on the empire building. I think what we see that the U.S. military has been doing over the last 18 years, at the behest of politicians, it's not the military that's doing this on their own, it's our politicians that we vote for, or somebody's voting for them. I don't think I voted for any of the, well, you know what I'm saying. But, the politicians that we keep electing are warmongers. They are warmongers. And even though Trump says, I want peace. And you mentioned this, the baby Trump balloon that we had over at the National Mall at the 4th of July. Well, that was a bit controversial, as you can imagine, because there were a lot of Trump supporters that decided they were coming to Washington for the 4th of July. And to see that balloon up there, and another thing that somebody else had brought in, which was Trump sitting on the throne. I mean, when that thing came in, I thought, oh my God, we're all going to get killed over this. And they had a little recording in the thing. He was actually sitting on a toilet with his pants down and tweeting. He had a phone in his hand, and there was a recording of him saying, what he normally says, I'm the biggest genius in the world, I'm the this, I'm the that. And then there would be a little noise. Poop, 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 poop. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to cause a riot. What it caused, every little kid that was coming with their parents as they walked by, they loved it. They loved it. So we ended up having a lot of conversations, and most of them were not violent. There were a few confrontations, that's for sure. But it was an opportunity to talk to a large number of people that really we didn't agree with our political views, and to the credit of those folks that were supporting of Trump, they wanted their picture taken with this baby balloon. So we ended up, ushering them in so that they could get their picture taken, and then, you talk to them. We had 4 young men that arrived, that, they were probably 16, 17 years old. They arrived with the biggest paint up on their faces I have ever seen. They had flags, painted flags on their, and they had red, white, and blue things that when they walked into our little area, we thought, oh boy, this is going to be trouble, because we were really afraid that somebody was going to knife the president. And no, but these kids, they came over and we said, well, why are you right here? Well, they said, we've never spoken to a liberal before. And we want to talk to some liberals. And we said, well, we're not so sure we're all liberals in that, we're progressive, we want peace. And they said, yeah, we do too, and that's what Trump wants. And that's why we like Trump, is because he wants peace. No, and if you take the time to talk to a lot of Trump supporters, that is one of the reasons that they voted for him. That he had said, I will meet with anyone, anywhere, I will work for peace, I'll try to stop these wars in Afghanistan. And to his credit, he has done a little bit of that. And I'll kind of go through that this morning. Now, don't get the thing that this is a Trump rally or anything. But you have to kind of give credit where credit is due on some of these things. And Peter, if you could do the next slide. What I want to talk about today are hotspots in the world, whether these hotspots are really for our national security or whether the hotspots are part of the empire building. And if you look, there's the big wide world, but where are things happening that we have to be concerned about? And I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'm going to talk about 5 of them that are things that we are working on every day. Peter, the next one, please. And the first one will be Iran. Iran. I was part of a delegation that went to Iran in February this year. Code Pink Women for Peace put it all together. We had 28 people that went. This photograph is of us meeting, or after we had met for 2 hours with the foreign minister of Iran. 2 hours he gave to this American peace delegation. I mean, it was stunning. We walked through the halls of the foreign ministry, beautiful, beautiful halls of mirrored glass mirrors. I mean, a fantastic, beautiful, beautiful place. And then, we thought, well, he was probably just going to meet us in, a foyer and then say, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate your being here, and that's it. Well, no. We walked into a massive conference room, and he sat there for 2 hours to talk to us about U.S.-Iranian relations, and starting back from the history of the overthrow of Iran by the Shah, the overthrow of Mossadegh, the elected leader there, and then the litany of all of the things that you all know about, of U.S.-Iranian relationships, the 79 overthrow of the Shah, the Iranian Revolution, and then, well, as we all know, if there's a term revolution associated with anything, it's big trouble, because the United States doesn't like revolutions. And if you put revolution on any sort of political thing, you can be guaranteed that Washington, it doesn't matter who's in power, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, they're going to go after you. And as we see with the Cuban Revolution, the Nicaraguan Revolution, I mean, these are things that have lived with us for decades now. That if it's a revolution, the U.S. government will try to take it down. So here we have the Iranian foreign minister that spoke to us for 2 hours. 2 hours. And when we left, it was like, oh my God, this is just unbelievable. So, we did a video of it, and you can watch it on YouTube. It's a remarkable one, and we've done the transcript of it. So that if you want to go through it and hear and see the exact words that Zarif was using, he is a fluent English speaker. He was studying in the United States when the Iranian Revolution happened in 1979. And because he was already in the U.S., the revolution got in touch with him and said, we know you're kind of young, like he was a graduate student at NYU or something. You're kind of young, but we need somebody right now over at the UN. Would you be our first ambassador to the United Nations? So since being a young person, he's been involved in the political dynamics of Iran. And of course, he was one of the ones, the key negotiator for the nuclear, the JCPOA agreement with the United States and 4 other countries 3 years ago under the Obama administration. Well, as he was talking to us, he said, you know, we are very heart-struck about this, that the Trump administration has thrown away the agreement. And our people, our Iranian people, were counting on, if we did sign something like this, that there would be benefits to it. That was the whole point, to have some benefits, like sanctions being lifted, like the money that the United States has held, that is Iranian money, billions of dollars, that's been held since 1979, that those monies would come back to the revolution, that we would become a part of the community of nations, that you all would accept us as equals, and that our students could travel again back to the United States. You know, you probably met many Iranian students at universities here in Minnesota. For a period of time, even during the revolution, they were able to travel and study. But under the Trump administration, they are part of the sanctioned groups that now we have very, very few Iranian students that are here. So he was saying, you know, our people are really upset about, we signed the deal and then you all threw it away. Well, so, you know, we were dejected because we're part of the problem. We can't get a continuous presidential routine going so that you can really trust what the United States is doing. And that the rest of the day we went and did other things, and then at night we got back to the hotel, and about 11 o'clock, as many of us were downstairs where the internet was working the best, and writing our little articles, and suddenly someone said, uh-oh, Twitter's on, the foreign minister just resigned. What? The foreign minister just resigned. And in his tweet that said he was resigning, it was because he could not provide to the Iranian people what he had promised through this agreement. And it was like, you know, he resigned over this. No wonder he had so much time. 2 hours with us. He was going to resign that afternoon. So, no. But as people in the hotel, as we were frantically kind of going around, what's happening? They said, well, don't worry about it. Usually when he resigns, he'll be brought back into the government in about 2 days, because he's such a well-respected figure that there's no one really to take his place, but he resigned for a point. And one of them was that indeed he needed to signal to the Iranian people that he and the government understood that people were rightfully upset, that indeed not only had sanctions not been lifted, but indeed the Trump administration had put even more sanctions on Iran. Let's go ahead to the next picture. And here is the foreign minister. He's an elegant guy, just a really, really fine fellow. And let's go to the next one. And one, okay. Now, why are we concerned about Iran? Well, for a variety of reasons, but one of the things that I'm particularly concerned about is the history of that country. You know, it's 3,500 years old, that country. And how old is the United States? I mean, like, are we even at 300 yet?
No.
2 something?
40.
You know, so here we have the U.S. empire, tiny little blip in the history of the world, trying to dictate things to this culture and this civilization that's been going on for 3,500 years. And when you are in Iran, in fact, how many of you all have been to Iran? 2, 3, 3 people. Well, it is, I'm sure you would say, it's a trip you ought to take. It's a beautiful country. It's got the most beautiful mosques and madrasas, and as you can see from this picture, the detailed work of all of the mosaics that have gone into building these remarkable, remarkable architectural wonders that would be destroyed if the United States attacks it. I mean, we know what will happen. We know what happened to Baghdad. We know what happened there, where the U.S. went in, started bombing things, and then if they didn't bomb it, they didn't protect it, like the Museum of Baghdad that had some of the wonderful works of history of Mesopotamia. The U.S. didn't guard it, and people took everything. So there are a lot of reasons that we don't want war with the Iranians. The Iranians, as you meet Iranians, they're just the nicest, kindest people in the whole world. They treat you with such dignity and respect when you go to Iran. The food there is delicious. But preserving the people of Iran. I mean, normally the United States attacks countries that have less than maybe 25 million people. And most of the time, even less than that. I mean, you think about Cuba. Considering how big a threat Cuba is to the United States and has been for the last 60 years, you'd think there's probably about 500 million people living there. Anybody have any idea how many people live in Cuba? Less than 10 million. And another place that, well, how many people live in Iran? It's a big country. 80 million people live there. 80 million. And they've been under sanctions since the revolution 40 years ago, and yet their economy domestically is going fine. They can produce things that we don't produce for ourselves. I mean, if we didn't have China making all of our clothes, and if the Chinese stopped sending them to them, we'll be naked in a week. You know, but the Iranians, they still make everything. So they have a very experienced military, a big military. I mean, they're experienced because they've been in Iraq, they've been in Syria. We think our military is experienced, but they too have had lots of experience. And as we see just from last week, they've got some equipment that can take down U.S. military drones. And if they can take down a drone, they can take down all sorts of other things. So this issue of Iran is a very important one. And just this last week, apparently we now know that the Trump administration has been having backdoor conversations with the Iranian government. And Trump still says that he would meet with the senior leadership of Iran. So I hope that'll happen, because right now the tenseness in the Persian Gulf area, where the Iranians now say that they have taken two tankers, it's very, very dicey. And that could be the place where an inadvertent, accidental action could really get us into a big mess. Let's go to the next one, Peter. So if you all want to go to Iran, Code Pink Women for Peace has 2 more trips this year. One's in September and one in October. And these trips are by far the least expensive trips you will ever find anywhere. The one that goes in September costs airfare not included, and it's usually around $1,000. But the in-country for a week is $1,000. And for 8 days on the second one is $1,250. So it's a really, really good deal. And you'll be seeing places and meeting people. And we need to get more Americans over there. We need to be able to make sure that there's a lot of people who've been recently to Iran. It's not an easy place to get to. And the Iranian government is very careful about giving out visas. So but with Code Pink, we're pretty sure we're going to be able to have these trips that are running at the same time, or running on schedule in September and then one in October. I think all of those are filled up right now, but if you express your interest to Code Pink, then they'll start setting up other trips later on. Let's go to the next hot spot. Well, this is a picture of Pyongyang, North Korea. And as Bill mentioned, in 2015, I was part of a 30-women delegation called Women Crossed the Dmz. 30 women from 15 countries. two Nobel Peace Laureates, Marie Maguire from Northern Ireland and Lima Gobi from Liberia. The delegation was nominally led by Gloria Steinem. She kindly allowed us to use her name, and she went on this thing. So what did we do? For a week we were in North Korea. I'll just ask, has anybody else been to North Korea? Every now and then there will be a hand that'll go up. But in fact, in Hawaii, I was giving a talk at the University of Hawaii, and I asked that question, and there was a woman in the back. She raised her hand. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I did say North Korea, not South Korea." And she went, "Yeah, I know what you said." And I was like, well, and then I started thinking, oh, so how did you get over there? She said, I was in the U.S. military. Oh, yeah. So what's the U.S. military doing in North Korea, for God's sakes? I mean, that's a little dangerous. Well, through the Obama years, the U.S. military had units that would go from South Korea into North Korea to help retrieve remains of people that were killed during the Korean War. And in fact, that can start up again. The equipment is still in South Korea. All there needs to be is an agreement between the U.S. and North Korea to go digging around again to places where North Koreans have identified that they feel very certain there still are remains of the crew members of that aircraft that crashed. They have identified where all of these things are. And even during the Trump administration, after he met with Kim Jong-un the first time, there were remains of 50 service members that were returned to the U.S. The North Koreans have boxes of lots and lots of retrieved remains that they're willing to give to the U.S. And it just has to be a better relationship before these things come in. But this is an interesting picture. I mean, if you can see it, there are two women that are leaning over and their hands are crossed like this. Well, this is over a 10-lane boulevard in Pyongyang. These are huge, massive statues. And these are women for reconciliation. Yeah. The Korean people really want to have this war, Korean War, 75 years, almost 70 years. They want this war ended, an armistice signed, so that they can kind of get back on a footing where they don't have to be wondering whether or not the U.S. is going to be invading, the U.S. is going to attack. While we were in Pyongyang, we had a conference with 250 North Korean women. It was a conference on peace. And the North Korean women told about the war that they still remember like yesterday. And when you really think about it, that over 4 million people were killed during that war. 3,800 or 38,000 U.S. were killed there, and that's in a period of only 3 years. It was a much more intense war than the Vietnam War, where we had 58,000 people that were killed in a period of 13 years. But in 3 years, 38,000 U.S. were killed, plus allies, but then you look at how many Koreans were killed. The policy of the United States in the Korean War was to not let one building in North Korea be standing. It was a scorched earth policy that was carried out by bombing raids that leveled that entire country. So they remember that very, very well. Well, from our side, we had Marie Maguire talk about reconciliation in Northern Ireland. We had Lima Gobi talk about reconciliation in Liberia. We had a woman talk about Colombia and relationships now with the FARC, trying to get the war there stopped. We had a woman from the Philippines that talked about the Philippine war. And we also, from the United States, we are a conflict country, so we presented what the U.S. has been doing. Not that we are reconciling with many people, but it was important that we acknowledge to them what the United States has been doing. So we had the conference, and then this was followed by what you see here, which was a march of 5,000 North Korean women in their beautiful, beautiful Korean outfits, that lined the streets here as we marched through it. They even have a marching band, a marching women's band that looks like one of ours in our high schools here, complete with the drum major's hat, the thing, the high boots. I mean, when we saw that, it was like, holy smoke! How did this happen? But it was quite amazing. You know, when you go to places like this, you are amazed because we don't know much about these countries, and there are a lot of things behind the scenes that are going on that we need to know about. It is tough to get to North Korea, and the Trump administration has made it even tougher because of the requirement now that if an American citizen wants to go, you have to apply for a special validation passport. And with that passport, then you can go to the North Korean government and see if you can get a visa. But so far, there have been just a handful of Americans that have been able to get this passport out of the Trump administration because they don't want us going back over there right now. Before the Trump administration came in, there were quite a few Americans that would be going to North Korea. All you had to do is get a visa, normally in Beijing, and some of the ways that people got to North Korea were signing on to trips, 3-day trips, and they were called the beer trips. Did you know that North Korea has a whole series of microbreweries? Yeah, they invited the Poles and the Czechs to come in and set up all of these breweries in the basements of the international hotels. So there are a lot of young people, and it may have been that Otto Warmbier that tragically ripped down a poster on a wall and then was held in North Korea, and then whatever happened to him, and then was finally released and then died very quickly back home. But there have been a lot of people that have been trying to go to North Korea, and it is important to go there too. You know, we have some U.S. NGOs that have been working in North Korea for over 40 years. The American Friends Service Committee has had an agricultural project in North Korea for over 40 years. The Mennonites have had agricultural projects there. Various Christian groups. Now you keep hearing about, you know, the evil North Koreans and the persecution of this, that, and the other thing. Well, they have a whole series of Christian groups that are in North Korea. Some of them are medical missionaries that have set up some of the best medical facilities for the North Koreans and Americans that are living there full time. So it's kind of a crazy thing. We definitely do want to have better relations with them, and that's the way, with better relations, the whole issue of human rights there, I think, would start improving a lot. Pete, if we could go one more. And the whole issue of Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un. It's been kind of wild, a wild trip, hasn't it, between the first time of meeting in Singapore and then meeting in Hanoi and that falling apart, and then more of the rhetoric of the bombastic words and tweets and all. You've got to hand it to the North Koreans, though. You know, they come up with some pretty interesting words to describe our politicians. I really like the ones that they use for George Bush and the earlier ones for Trump. I mean, they really go after them. And of course, Trump hands them right back with, you know, fire and fury and all this sort of stuff. But when we think of a tweet and in 24 hours later, that Trump has figured out how to get Kim Jong-un to meet him at the DMZ. And seeing that happen was pretty darn remarkable. So about the only credit I'll give President Trump is that he has been trying to work on this issue of North Korea. And I wish him well on that, because it really will serve us better if we can tamper down all of the issues that are coming from North Korea. And then let's go on to the next one. This was, how many of you all been to Cuba? Yeah, now we're going. More. And why haven't the rest of you gone? You know, it's even with the new sanctions that the Trump administration has put on Cuba, you know, after the Obama administration opened diplomatic relations with Cuba, which was a great deal, and lessen some of the sanctions. Now the Trump administration, mainly because they have in it John Bolton and Elliott Abrams, two of the guys who back from the Bush administration and from the Reagan administration. Actually, Elliott Abrams was one of the assistant secretaries of state during the Reagan administration when the U.S. was causing trouble all over Central America and in Cuba. Well, it is a place that, I mean, it's fascinating. You know, you can see the old cars that are up there. It's a place where it's like a museum in a way. You'll see cars that you can remember back from your childhood. You know, that one family in town that had a convertible, that Oldsmobile convertible or that little Chevy convertible. Well, you'll go back in time looking just at the cars. It's really a remarkable place. And let's go to the next one. And one of the reasons I've been going there is the last 3 years I've been invited to speak in Guantanamo City. Guantanamo that we know as the prison of Guantanamo. A naval base that has been given to the United States in perpetuity. In 1898, that's how far back it goes. It's the longest running U.S. military base in the world. And what do they do there? Well, they've had Haitian refugees that have been put in there. They've had, well, it's been used as a refugee place for a while, but then in 2002, that's when we started putting in prisoners that were being taken primarily from Afghanistan. And over the years, 779 prisoners were put in Guantanamo. Right now, there are 38 that are left, and 8 of them still have trials that supposedly are coming up. The rest of them are what they call forever prisoners, that the U.S. is not going to prosecute them. And we have right here in our audience, Todd, now stand up. Todd was one of the defense attorneys at Guantanamo. I'm sorry? And still is. And still is. Well, every other year, the Cuban government, the Cuban Movement for Peace, MovePAS, has a conference in the city of Guantanamo. The name of the conference is the Abolition of Foreign Military Bases. And it brings in people from all over the world to talk about the military bases in their countries. So I usually am invited to talk about U.S. military bases in some part of the world. This year I spoke about the U.S. bases in Eastern Europe and Scandinavia and U.S. military exercises there, because most people don't know that we are increasing the numbers of military exercises because of the threat from Russia. So right along the Russian border are all of these now U.S. military units that are put in there. Some of the Brits have units in there. A NATO buildup along the Russian border, which is being responded by a buildup along that border by the Russians. So that's another one of the big hot spots that we have. But every 2 years we have this conference in Guantanamo City about the abolition of foreign military bases. So if any of you all want to go on the next one, we'll put out the word through Vets for Peace. There were 2 of us that were Vets for Peace that were there this time. Monisha Rios, who's a PhD student, and myself. The previous time we had a delegation of about 8 people that were there. So we do want, the Cubans love to have Veterans for Peace there, and we do want to make sure that we have a good delegation the next time. Okay, next. Let's see. Let's go to the next one. And here's just some pictures of looking out from the small town that's right on the border with the military base. I'm over on the right side, and the first set of buildings are Cuban buildings, but in the background you can see U.S. buildings. And this one on the right, you can see radar domes and things like that over on the other side. The bay, Guantanamo Bay, is a huge, huge bay. It's a huge resource that the Cubans would love to have back because the amount of fishing that could be done from there, If they had control of it, the lack of regulations of when they can come in and out would go away. So there's a real reason that they would like to have it back, of course, but it's not so much that they'll be losing money. You know, does anybody know how much the U.S. pays each year for rent? $4,800. What a deal, yeah. Well, that's, you know, that's gunboat diplomacy, isn't it? You know, back in 1898, whoever the Stuckey was that was forced to sign this agreement in perpetuity, that's what they signed for, $4,000. The Cubans have every annual check. They keep it. So they have a stack that they have not cashed. Okay, let's go to the next one. And the next hot spot is Venezuela. The attempted coup, this U.S.-sponsored coup by designating a young 35-year-old Venezuelan, Juan Guaido, as the president, and allowing the Guaido factions to take over diplomatic facilities in Washington, D.C. The U.S., well, it is a coup attempt by all measures. And not to say that the Maduro government is a perfect government. It's not. It's got plenty of problems. There are over 4 million Venezuelans that have left the country. 4 million. And it's a country of about 30 million. So a huge exodus. But trying to get, you know, rather than the U.S. trying to do this by coup, rather than sponsoring diplomatic talks to try to resolve these issues, is something that we're trying to push. And that's why 30 U.S. citizens asked the Venezuelan government if they would like for us to occupy their embassy in Washington, D.C. to prevent the Guaido people from just coming in and taking over. They had already been allowed to take over 2 facilities in Washington, 2 military facilities. And we were very upset, you know, that here, you know, our government is just giving away the buildings of another country. So that's when the Embassy Protective Collective was formed. And you probably read some about it. We had 30 people in it, and then as time went on, the last people had been in there 35 days when finally the U.S. diplomatic security, the FBI, every law enforcement agency you can name came in and took out the last 4 people. That, what? Illegally, yeah. Well, that's, I agree with you illegally, but that's the U.S. government's way of doing things. That it's not a U.S. government property. The government of Venezuela, which the U.S. does not recognize now, and hasn't for about 6 months at this point, said we will do whatever we want to. We will take over this building. So all of these folks, 30 people at one stage, lived in the embassy, cooked in the embassy, got water, and held on to the embassy, while outside there were hundreds of people, both the Guaido faction and people saying we shouldn't be doing a coup, who every day had confrontations. And I mean, this was pretty tough. And as you can see up here, our National President of Veterans for Peace, Jerry Condon, he's the guy sitting down right now after he had been arrested and thrown on the ground and his face bloody for a weapon of mass destruction. He tried to throw a cucumber up to an open window, some food. That was it. He threw a cucumber up, and the cops just mobbed him and threw him down. He ended up bloody and all this. Well, it was a good sacrifice, because that got a lot of attention about the brutality that we were seeing every single day from the cops, where we were trying to be there as a voice of reason and a voice to say, our government should not be taking over these facilities. Well, they've taken it over, but interestingly enough, they have not allowed the Guaido faction to go into the embassy, which is very, well, it shows that there's a lot of dissension within the U.S. government about what would happen. I have written several articles about this as a former diplomat, saying how in the world can the U.S. government decide who can be in another person's embassy? And if we do that to them, then we have a large embassy down in Caracas, Venezuela. And what if the Venezuelans decide that, okay, fine, we're not going to recognize the Trump government, and we're going to take over your big facility? Well, that's a theoretical argument, because you know exactly what would happen if anybody tried to take over the U.S. Embassy. There would be blood on the floor, that the U.S. would not be allowing that at all. Let's go to the next one. Well, another place, another hot spot, Nicaragua. I just got back from Nicaragua 2 days ago from Veterans for Peace delegation that we had. 8 people went down. How many of you all have been to Nicaragua over the years in solidarity groups? Yeah, quite a few. Well, this is the 40th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution. It was July 19th, 1979. 79 was a momentous year. Not only did the Iranian Revolution happen in 79, the Nicaraguan Revolution happened in 79, the revolution in Grenada happened in 79, and the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 79. So who was president? Jimmy Carter. And I mean, what he had to deal with was quite remarkable, to have all of those events happening in 1 year. Well, so it is now, 40 years later, the Sandinista Revolution. Now, do you all remember what happened? The Contras, the U.S. sponsored the Contras to overthrow the revolution. And then finally, in the late 80s, there was an agreement that the U.S. would stop funding the Contras that had killed over 50,000 people in Nicaragua, a huge number, because that, at the time, there were only 3 million people that were living in Nicaragua 40 years ago. Now the population's up to 6 million. But when you think of the percentages, it was a massacre. So 79, the revolution happened. 89 is when they had the elections, or 90, which was the Sandinista said, okay, if you stop funding the Contras, we'll get the war stopped, and yes, we will agree to have elections. And that happened in 1990, and were the Sandinistas reelected? No, they weren't. And as the Sandinistas that we talked to said, people were so tired of war. It had been 20 years that there had been war, all these casualties, and they knew that if the Sandinista government stayed in power, the U.S. would continue to destabilize it. So the only way to stop the U.S. destabilization and get some peace was to get the Sandinistas out. So they voted them out, and for 17 years, 3 successive presidential administrations of 6 years apiece, 18 years, there were neoliberal type organizations or administrations that totally undercut all of the educational and health benefits that the Sandinista Revolution had been working on for the people of Nicaragua. But during this 18 years of peace, it was stable. International businesses came in. In fact, my first assignment with the Diplomatic Corps was in Nicaragua from 1987 to 1989. And for the very first time I went back, 30 years later, just now, and the changes in the country are remarkable because there was stability. There was an economic atmosphere that businesses could say, we don't think there's going to be another war. We will invest in it. So there are big hotels, Hilton, Westin, all of those hotels are there. There's a big tourism industry going because Nicaragua is it is the safest country in Central America and the second safest in all of the Western Hemisphere. Canada is number 1 and Nicaragua is number 2 until April of last year, where a destabilization that's one more step. 18 years the neoliberals were in, and then they got voted out 12 years ago. And guess who came back in? The Sandinistas, and Daniel Ortega is the head of the government. So, as I mentioned, the U.S. doesn't like a revolution. So from the very beginning, the U.S. had been trying to destabilize the country. And a year and a half ago, in a very well-planned, orchestrated, financed series of actions of hiring thugs on the streets, druggies, alcohol, young kids, and telling them it doesn't matter what you do, you just tear up Jack. You burn buildings, you go after the police, we got snipers, we're going to kill the police. 22 police were sniped to death. 383 of them were wounded, to the extent that finally Daniel Ortega said, well, and what did we hear here? We heard the government of Nicaragua was killing those peaceful protesters. Amnesty International and the International Committee for Human Rights all have said it was the government's fault, and the government killed all these people. Well, when you go down there, you're going to get a little bit different story. And when you start reading of all of the U.S. interventions of National Endowment for Democracy, the Republican Institute, the Democratic Institute, that were doing social media classes on how you move messages, how you use disinformation. You know, for those of us that have been in the military, it's called PSYOP, psychological operations. And that's exactly what this was, the psychological operation to get the people so fearful of what was happening by sending in false information. And that information is still here in the United States. There are a lot of people that are saying, well, it was the Sandinista government that killed all of these people. When you get down here and you get the list of them, it's not that at all. So it was important for our delegation to go down there. And we did meet with, well, let's see, let's go back again. We did, one more. Yeah, there we go. We did meet on the last night that I was there, which was 3 nights ago, I guess. We did meet with Daniel Ortega. And that was really interesting. I had been there 30 years ago, and at the time, the U.S. government was in our tiny little embassy, in which most people had already been thrown out of the country by the Sandinista government. I was one of the few that was left there, but I had never met the president of the country. But he was very, very taken the fact that we had a Veterans for Peace delegation there. And of course, you know that one of our members, Brian Wilson, lives in Nicaragua now. He's our member that was back in 1986, I believe it was. He and others, including Jerry Condon, our national president of VFP, were out in Concord, California at a weapons depot. And this weapons depot was sending weapons to Central America. So for weeks, they had been trying to stop the trains. And they'd get on the track, stop the trains, and then once they would leave, the train would go on through. Well, this one day, the train didn't stop and ran over Brian. And it's a wonder that he's still alive, because he lost so much blood. Both legs were cut off. It was a miracle that he survived. Well, he has been very famous in Central America, because here's a man, an American, who was trying to stop these weapons from going down into Central America, and he almost gave his own life with it. So the government of Nicaragua several years ago said, Brian, if you want to come and live in Nicaragua, we will find a little house for you, and we'd love to have you come. And so we did. And so Veterans for Peace is already known there because of Brian. But then to have our delegation go down there was really, really important. We talked to 3 veterans groups in Nicaragua. There are 3 or 4 different kinds of combatants there. There's the people that were in the Somoza army that was thrown out by the Sandinistas. Then the Sandinista army. Then there are the Contras, the ones that fought against the Sandinista army. All of them now formed together because they're all combatants. They just happen to fight on different sides, but they're all military veterans. And it was quite amazing to be in meetings with them when they would go over their history of where they had fought, and then one of them would poke the other one going, yeah, I was on the other side. Yeah, you were shooting at me on that day. But we wanted to meet with them because we would like to form a Veterans for Peace chapter in Nicaragua. And I think they may decide at some stage to do that, which would be a really big step for them. I mean, here the U.S. is destabilizing the country, and yet veterans are thinking about joining with other veterans from the United States that stand for peace. I mean, these shirts, Veterans for Peace, are so important for us. Okay, let's see. Let's go on to the next one, please. We were talking a little bit earlier about nuclear weapons, and thank you all very, very much for your push on getting people to sign petitions that we should not have nuclear weapons anymore. If we think back in the 1945 to 53 or later, the testing of these nuclear weapons for the United States primarily took place, of course, on somebody else's property. We don't want those things on ours, so we went to the Marshall Islands and tested a lot of nuclear and atomic weapons in the 50s. And let's go to the next one. And as you all know, our Veterans for Peace organization has for the last 10 years been renovating the Golden Rule, a little sailboat that had sailed in 1958 to Hawaii and was on its way to the Marshall Islands for the crew members, who are all Quakers, to be human shields, to go into the nuclear test area and say, don't test anymore, we're here, you're going to kill Americans if you do this. Well, they got as far as Hawaii, and the U.S. government then put a new regulation saying civilians cannot go into this test area in the Marshall Islands. Well, being good Quakers, they said, forget that, we're going anyway. So they, let's do one more picture. So they went 3 different times, they tried to escape Honolulu, and this is one of the pictures where the little 34-foot boat called the Golden Rule had gotten out of Honolulu Harbor, but then was stopped by a U.S. Coast Guard cutter and brought back into Honolulu. So for 3 times they tried to get out, couldn't get out. Every time the captain of the boat and the crew were thrown in jail. And so they tried. But this did bring attention, that there was this little boat out in Hawaii that the crew members were trying to get up to the Marshall Islands. And at that time, back in 1958, was the big scare of radioactivity stuff falling all over the U.S. The strontium-90 that was coming out of mother's milk and cows and all that. So that was the beginning of the anti-nuke movement. And this little tiny boat held a great deal of what would you call it? It was a very important part of this. And people all over the United States would be marching to say, free the Golden Rule crew, free the Golden Rule crew. Well, the boat, they finally let the crew and the captain go. The boat was somehow gotten back to the mainland, and for 50 years it disappeared. And it was found derelict on one of the beaches up in Humboldt Bay. And 2 of our Veterans for Peace chapters up there started renovating it. And it took them about 3 years, which I think is the fastest project we've ever had in the history of Vets for Peace. Because most of the time, we've got a good heart, but we're not the fastest in the world. And in fact, well, how many of you all have donated to the Golden Rule? I'm sure you have. Yeah, good, thank you. Well, and Paula, how about stand up and show them your T-shirt? One of the things that you can get is this beautiful T-shirt, the Golden Rule. Well, finally, after going up and down the west coast of the United States for 3 years, dropping into ports and having educational things about the dangers of nuclear weapons, and challenging the U.S. military in their fleet days. They're going into San Francisco and they bring in all these big ships or up in Seattle or down in San Diego. And our little boat was right out there next to the aircraft carriers with our big sail that says peace. And in fact, let's go back one. There you can see it. It's a beautiful little boat, only 34 feet long. It's a tiny boat. And after 3 years of going up and down the West Coast, somebody said, well, we ought to go on the same mission that the Golden Rule did, in 1958. So let's go to Hawaii, then the Marshall Islands, then to Guam, then to Okinawa, then to Japan, to be in Japan by August 6, 2020, which is the 75th anniversary of the U.S. dropping of those horrible bombs on Hiroshima, and then 3 days later on Nagasaki. So that's what is happening right now. And you will be thrilled to know that after 3 false starts where the boat had gone out 150 miles and then something happened, this happened or that happened, they had to come back. Finally, the boat is on the way. It's 700 miles outside of San Diego. In 2.5 weeks, it should be arriving in Hilo, Hawaii. Yay! And then it would stay in the Hawaiian Islands in August, September, October, November, and then in December, it will head to the Marshall Islands, where we will have educational events in the Marshall Islands, and then we'll go on to Guam, Okinawa, and then on to mainland Japan. Helen Jacquard is the operations director. Let's give her a big hand. She has had, she knows more about that boat than anybody else now. She really does. And having to put out all the fires of, you know, a boat is just something to put money, the hole you put money into, well, we've had our fair share of that, but it's in good shape now. We have a great captain, we have a great crew, and we're looking forward to greeting the Golden Rule when she arrives in Hilo, Hawaii. So there are a lot of other things that we could talk about for sure, and if you'd like to ask any questions, we can go into different areas, but that's kind of what I wanted to share with you. Some of the things that we've been doing over the last year, places that you all and friends of you have been to, and to encourage you to think about going to these places, these conflict places, because we need to have your eyes and ears on the ground, writing articles about what you see, because in general, what we see on the ground is not what we hear from our media and from our government. So with that, I want to thank you very, very much. And And I think we've got a few minutes for some questions.
Keep going here.
Yeah, I just have a question. You talked about Nicaragua being the safe one, but what about Costa Rica? Do you have any military there?
Well, that's a very good point. We hear how safe Costa Rica is, but when you look at the statistics that are coming out of the organizations that track all of that sort of stuff, to include the World Health Organization, they say Nicaragua is safer than Costa Rica is.
I understand a lot of Nicaragua.
Well, some of them did, yes. But that's what the statistics are showing, or that's the version we got. Yeah, and you always have to know, you always have to question things too. Thank you.
Well, I was interested in something really simple on one of the slides where you were showing when you were in Cuba. You had Monisha Rios there, and I know Monisha, and so I thought, God, that looks like Monisha.
Yes, indeed.
That was.
Monisha came. She was on the delegation 2 years ago, and she came back on this one. And she's in the final stages of her PhD work at San Luis Obispo. Yeah, so it was great to have her with us. Thank you.
Former member of the board.
Yes, a former board member of Vets for Peace.
Well, when you were saying the United States doesn't like revolutions, I yelled out, except for color revolutions.
True.
And of course, you have to always be skeptical of when they hijack language. And the so-called color revolutions is when we go in, stir up all kinds of trouble, and then pretend we're in the righteous side, overturning the dictator or the government, etc. Soros was a big funder of this, all over, especially in Eastern Europe, etc. Now, just recently, Soros combined with the Koch brothers, and a lot of people, you saw this probably, a lot of people thought, oh, maybe the worm has turned. Maybe they are finally starting to see that all of this intervention is backfiring. And so there is a little hope in that respect. But then a lot of us are pretty skeptical because Soros was behind all of this. What is your opinion on this new appearance? And it does have some credibility to it because Trita Parsi is the director, etc. So what's your take on the new non-intervention, Quincy, it's called the Quincy Institute. The United States should not go looking abroad for monsters that Soros and Koch brothers are putting millions of dollars into.
Well, it's a very good point, and thank you for parsing the terms between the revolutions, color revolutions and the others. Yeah, that's a good point. And this new think tank, it's the newest think tank that's started up in Washington in years, and this the coalition of the Koch brothers and whoever else, Soros and all, and then getting somebody like Trina Parsi, who has been the spokesperson for non-intervention in Iran, and he's going to be the executive director of it. So I do trust Trina. He's a good, honest guy, but as you mentioned, where this money is coming from should give us pause. But it is the newest think tank in town, and I don't know how many people they've hired so far, but it certainly has caused a stir of people that are part of the Washington swamp, so to speak. It's a new place that they can go work. So keep your eyes open and your ears open for about them. Thank you. Yep.
And when you talked about Nicaragua, you mentioned Amnesty International and some of these other human rights organizations and how they were very falsely blaming the Sandinista government for repression and murder, when in fact, I think just about everyone killed last year in Nicaragua was a Sandinista or a police officer or just an innocent bystander. It was the violent protesters doing the violence. My question to you, is why is Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, why are these organizations that many people consider very reputable, why are they doing this? Why are they basically on the side of the U.S. government when it comes to these issues? They do the same thing in Venezuela too.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an excellent question of why are these reputable human rights organizations just honestly not telling the truth, and whether people have been bought off at the highest levels, I'm just not sure. But it is part of this whole thing of the U.S. government not liking the Cuban, the Venezuelan, the Nicaraguan revolutions and those that are currently in power. And not to say that each one of them, there are plenty of abuses that each one of those governments has done. They're not just clean as the driven snow, but in both of these cases of both Venezuela and Nicaragua, we're finding as you go down there, and we've had missions that have gone into Venezuela too, that what we are getting and what these international human rights organizations are writing about is totally wrong. And how we expose that, that's why we had this delegation, so that we can come back and we can write our version of it and hopefully have some real dialogue about why this is happening. And I honestly don't know why it is. You do. Okay. Bruce?
Yeah, and I came in a little late, and I heard that you did not bring up Ken and Tara. Yeah.
Well, good
I don't know
point.
if you did, so
Yeah.
maybe you can add some of that.
Absolutely, yes, and I should have a slide up there for our two vets for peace of Tara Koff and Ken Mayers, who have been in Ireland now for, 8 months? 4 or 5 months. Yeah, who got arrested for going on to the Shannon Airport, and apparently somebody cut a fence. That seems to be the biggest offense. And the Irish courts have said, no, you cannot go back to the United States and wait for your trial. We're keeping your passports and you have to wait here until we decide when the trial's going to be. And the latest intervention by the courts was just this last week, where they said, we don't quite know when we'll have the next court hearing. It might be in the end of the summer, it might not be. So these people are really being held hostage. There have been lots of people that have been arrested on the Shannon Airport and the point is that the Irish government is supposed to be a neutral government. It's not supposed to be involved in any war activities, and yet the U.S. government has been sending war planes and planes filled with military in through Shannon to refuel and then go on into the Middle East. And so the Irish activists, including our Reds for Peace chapter in Ireland, have gone onto the airport runway and taxiways numerous times. In fact, there's one lady who's, I think she's 90 years old now. She's been arrested in her wheelchair multiple times, but they just go to court and that's that. But here, I guess it's the first time we've had international folks that have been arrested, and the courts are throwing the book at them. Well, they haven't thrown the book at them yet, they just are slow rolling them on the timing of all this. I think we ought to, well, I probably shouldn't say this here. I think we need to get a couple of Irish citizens in a bar, and we hold them until Tarek and Ken are released. But we do need to support Ken and Tarek. They're on social media all the time. Be sure to, say something to them on social media. And there is a GoFundMe, because this is costing money. They're staying with various activists and all, but the lawyers need to have some sort of compensation, and so there's a GoFundMe that's now been set up. Thank you for that. Thank you. Yes, I'm going to, if it's okay, if you'll set that chair up here, I'm going to sit down for a minute. I'm still not recovered from a long flight from Nicaragua, and we were in Chicago yesterday in the heat of the day doing a Gaza Flotilla, and that's another, I didn't do Palestine in this talk, but we do want to remember Gaza and the West Bank and all of the folks that have been killed over the years there. So what we are doing on Gaza is we're asking, as the Gaza Flotilla, usually we have boats every 2 years that sail to challenge the Israeli naval blockade of Gaza. And the next time we will sail will be in 2020. But this year, in 2019, we want to have activities all over the U.S. to remind people what's happening in Gaza. So we're asking communities to organize some sort of flotilla locally. And today in Chicago, there are 17 kayak activists who are out on the Chicago River, and 2 electric boats filled with activists with banners and everything who are on the river. We're handing out all sorts, oh thank you Steve, thanks. We're handing out all sorts of literature about Gaza, and some of the literature is back on that back table if you'd like to take some. And if you'd like to organize anything in the Minneapolis area, we would love to have it. Because the whole point is educating our friends and neighbors of what's going on, what the Israeli government is doing to the people in the West Bank and in Gaza.
Talking about Nicaragua and the resurrection of the Golden Rule, it made me think of a box of tapes I have in a secret vault at home. In 1991, I think, before I knew there was a Veterans for Peace organization, we organized the Minnesota the teleconference that the Christic Institute did to try to keep the Iran-Contra hearings alive.
Oh.
And to make it so that people, actually went to jail or something. And I'm just wondering, I have the pre-tapes, the post-tapes, the video conference, and I just, didn't want to, might there be some value to that somewhere other than the archives that never get looked at again?
Well, it's a good point. I mean, how much stuff do we all have in our closets that it's like, these were very important tapes in this case,
Yeah.
and how can we get this to be used by scholars and academicians?
It includes, there's the tapes of the African-American leaders who were adamant that besides the arms going, there was the drugs going back into, but it's all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
haven't looked at it for years.
Wow. Well, do you even have a machine that you
Well, I
play it?
have, well, I mean, it's VHS, but I have a machine that I'm transferring VHS to DVDs,
Yeah.
which I haven't touched those. But anyway,
Well, it's a good point, and I don't know if universities in the area might be interested in it. Yeah, yeah. How many of you all have things in your closets that you think, you know, somebody ought to have this. We need to make sure that this is not thrown away. Yeah, I think all of us do, and maybe a project could be, you know, collecting all of this stuff. Swarthmore University has one of the largest collection of peace materials in the world, and they do take things from private individuals. Todd?
This is more of a comment, but I'm trying to frame it as a question. So I'm a friend of Peter Weiss, whom you know, and he got me onto an email list that's regarding torture. And in it, there's a lot of Obama officials, including at the Department of Justice, etc. And, you know, he got me on because he wanted an anti-militarist voice, which I think of adequately represented. But during the Syrian buildup for the first war, you know, not the clandestine one, but the open one they wanted, so many of these people, and they're from Amnesty International, all the major human rights groups and law professors, etc., against torture, but not necessarily against war. So I mocked them, you know, that, you know, they're against torture, but they're yet for depleted uranium being dropped all over Iran or Syria, whatever the case may be. But the other thing then, and you just mentioned Gaza, is in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper today, they have an article on Israeli fascism, and its roots going back to the interwar period. It's an article that doesn't go as fully in depth as it should. But the frustration I have, and I've studied political theory just for this purpose, is to define really, and I don't mean as a name-calling tactic, fascism, but in Israel, they don't hesitate to call Netanyahu a fascist, and his father was a fascist allied with Begin, and genuine fascists coming out of the interwar years. And how do we overcome this disposition, this predisposition of American people to think, you know, well, we're not fascists. You know, they'll bristle at that, or they'll bristle at a couple of other terms. But instead, they'll keep falling back on, oh, we're the exceptional people, blah, 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 benevolent, et cetera, this and that. And to me, it seems one of the biggest obstacles we have is to make Americans, and I don't mean in the Marxist way, you know, to call everybody a fascist, pardon me, or others who've always used it as a pure epithet, but I mean as a serious term to say, look, we meet that definition as Mussolini laid it down, a serious military aggressor, authoritarian country. And we're seeing it more that Donald Trump took the mask off, you know, that was maintained by Obama and Bush, and others, of course, before that. But, and of course, it all goes back to imperialism, but to get down to a serious discussion that what have we become? You know, we routinely murder millions of people around the world, but yet somehow we still maintain this image of ourselves as benevolent, etc. And to seriously, not just call names. I mean, when one of the Kagans initially called Donald Trump a fascist, I mean, to me, immediately thought, that's the pot calling the kettle black. And to really get people to think a little bit more and look historically at what we've done. And coming out of World War II, we genuinely did adopt many of the theories, political theories of the fascists on how we would go forward in providing national security. And I'll cut it off there. But again, how do we overcome this predisposition thing of good people?
Well, isn't that the truth? I mean, it's amazing that there is this feeling in our country that we can do no wrong. Anything that we do, the people that we kill deserve to be killed, or, you know, that sort of thinking. And the only way to do it is just to keep after it, keep having symposium, having pretty edgy titles on your workshops or your symposia that will kind of, you know, make people sit up and go and squirm like, are you kidding? That couldn't be us. But it is really just up to us to keep having these educational events that we talk about these things. And few people know all of the history of fascism. They don't, you know, they've kind of heard a little bit about it in World War II, but there's a lot of education we still have to do on that. And having, you know, there's a group called Refuse Fascism that that is their name, that's their button, and they have, in Honolulu, they have weekly meetings where they talk about various aspects of what's happened, what the government has done most recently, and tying it into the fascist criteria that is, it's very easy to spot when you know what to look for. Thank you for the comment and question.
Let's get the voice here. Hello, Ann. It's it's an honor to have you come to Peacestock again, and it's an honor that we have Peacestock. And we all, I believe in this room, appreciate the positive aspects of our Constitution. Though it's not a perfect document, it does have items like the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is for freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And our very own long-standing member, Ray McGovern, has been very instrumental in helping to stand up for freedom of the press and for WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And I want to say that as I followed Unity for Jay online, and Ray and a number of other people, like one of the people that was arrested at the Venezuelan embassy, Kevin Zeist, was on there. They had a lot of programs over a period of number of weeks. And there's a Susie 3D in Moscow, who's a refugee from New Zealand. She's incredible. She's written the history about Julian and what he's done. But I followed that and I thought, oh my God, we need to have an event in Minnesota. We need to have it. I need to do something. And I failed to be the first one, but Paulette, who's here, I understand today, and Pauline were instrumental in getting together an event. They were there, and I was there, and my friend Suzanne was there, and a few others. Todd Pierce was there, and it was an honor to be there. I just want to ask you if you have some comments to say about Unity for Jay, Julian Assange, freedom of the press.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Robert. Yeah, we cannot forget these people who have paid the ultimate price for their truth-telling, and whether it's Chelsea Manning, who's back in jail again because she refuses to answer questions at the Star Chamber, what's the actual term for it? Grand jury. Yeah, and where do you all remember what she did? She said in the very first grand jury, which was last fall, she said, everything that I have said and can say about this has already been in the transcript for my court-martial. And here are the transcripts, and just read them, they're there. And I'm not going to answer any more questions because it's all there. Well, that wasn't good enough for the grand jury or the prosecutor. And they said, no, we're not going to read the papers. You have to tell us in your own words. And she said, nope, I'm not going to do it. So she was in jail until the end of that grand jury, which was about 2 months. Then she was out of jail for maybe less than a month. And then another grand jury was established, and she said the same thing. So she's back in jail and will remain there until this grand jury is finished. And then Julian Assange, the Ecuadorian embassy walls were breached by the British military, or not military, but law enforcement, and he was dragged out, as you saw in the videos, and he is in prison and really, I think, awaiting the extradition that the U.S. has been trying to get him extradited to the U.S. for years. So these are people that really, they deserve our help, and to have events like you all did here, we need to be having them everywhere. Because these people have provided us with so much information about our government's criminal acts. They at their own jeopardy, they have put out materials that it would be 50 years before the government itself would declassify them. But we know a lot more about the inner workings of our government and the criminal acts that were allowed to take place because of those classified cables that they exposed. So to whatever you can do, whether it's a small conference, whether it's whatever, every time you post something on Facebook that we've had another event for Julian and Chelsea, that helps build a momentum. and lets our government know that we're watching them on what they're doing.
I'm just at our Paul Revere of the digital age.
The Paul Revere of the digital age, yeah, that's true. Thank you. Yes.
I was listening to a repeat of Tom Hartman when he was interviewing Mark Pocan from Wisconsin. And at one point, this is at 2 o'clock in the morning, but anyway, I heard someone call up and talk about Israel's nuclear weapons. And Mark Pocan said, I don't know anything about it. He basically cut this guy off. Obviously, he's never heard of Mordecai Vanunu, or he got a free trip to Israel by the
APAC?
APAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee. And I found it so disgusting. I can't believe it. I'm tempted to call in the next time I get here, but a lot of times I don't get in on those kinds of.
Well, he knows for sure that there are nuclear weapons. Every one of our members of Congress are briefed on that. And it's only, I mean, it's that they just won't publicly acknowledge it, but everybody knows, yeah.
Israel doesn't acknowledge it. But again, on Venezuela, I also was listening to the Zero Hour with Richard R.J. Askow on 950 in Minneapolis. And I heard the last part of Max Blumenthal talking to Richard about the fact that the Committee to Protect Journalism and Human Rights Watch doesn't give a crap about a journalist, a woman journalist from Telesur, which Hugo Chavez started to have some different kind of journalism or place to get the truth out. Because she's being attacked by the opposition, Juan Guaido. And this is something that is extremely disgusting.
Indeed it is. I mean, what these honest journalists are doing in terms of exposing what's going on there. And Max Blumenthal was in both Venezuela and in Nicaragua. He was there right after all the violence started in Nicaragua and has written some excellent, excellent articles that detail which U.S. government agency was a part of training Nicaraguans to attempt to overthrow the government. So please read his things, and then several of us on the delegation will be posting articles pretty soon about our comments. But Max's articles are really good.
I just want to say one more thing. For years, it was started by Women in Black. Summit and Snelling, people have been vigiling there every Friday from 4:30 to 5:30 for, well over a couple of decades. And I have been there, so I just wanted to let you know there are vigils for that. Because Palestinians are living under a brutal military occupation.
Thank you very much. They surely are.
One more question, a real short question.
Okay. I'm wondering why there isn't more information about what's being done on the West Bank. My brother works for the Lutheran Church there, and they have done terrible things. They've taken kids that threw rocks and tanks and put them in prison, and their parents don't even know where they are, and they've been in prison for years. And recently, they refused to let the fire trucks go through, and so 2 little boys died. They've just done awful things to people. They go into their homes and take all the things that they have that are video things and steal them. They don't let people into their hospital in Jerusalem. They kept a lady who was pregnant there and kept her at the border and said she wasn't pregnant, and then she died there on the border. They've done horrible things and nobody talks about that. And my brother tried to go to Washington and talk to people about that, and no one would listen to him.
The whole issue of Palestine is one of the toughest ones, and our politicians are running scared of it because they get so much money from the Zionist lobbyists. So trying to get, to the credit of the young 4 women that are just, including your own Ilhan Omar, they have brought up the issue of Palestine more in that short period of time they've been in Congress than any other congressperson has. So please do what you can do to support her when she's under such attack by the Trump administration. But there are some resources, of course, that do document these things. The Palestinian Center for Human Rights on a daily basis documents what's happened in the West Bank and in Gaza. Electronic Intifada has tons of articles about it. The group called We Are Not Numbers, which is a writing project that young Gazans get mentored by international writers, and some of the stories that they've written about life in Gaza have just been so poignant, so important for us to read. But you're right, the mainstream is not doing it. Yeah.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. We got a lot of hungry people here.
Yeah, Netanyahu and Trump are like two peas in a pod, that's for sure. That's a short answer.
You're probably getting hungry too, Anna.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we'll stop there. If we need to get something to eat, rest a little bit.
Thank you very much. Keep up the great work in Minnesota and Iowa and every place.
Holding hands around.